Hi, today we're looking at Genesis chapter 35, verses 1 through 15, as we move along through the life of Jacob here. Jacob is not the most godly man to this point and even beyond here, but he's still one that God has chosen and one of the patriarchs. So his life is worth a look because we can learn a lot from him. Now, today is a little bit different passage than some of the others, so let's just sort of dig into it and see what we got here. Have you ever heard the phrase, the chickens are coming home to roost? You might want to ask your class what that means. If you have a young adult class, they may not have ever heard of that phrase. So that could be sort of funny. But what it means to me is payback is coming, right? I mean, that's sort of what it means. And at the end of chapter 34, which we didn't cover in our lessons, that's what Jacob is worrying about. Things could not get much worse for his family. He had sneaked away from his father-in-law Laban, only to have to face his brother Esau, who he thought was going to kill him, who had vowed to kill him the next time he saw him, which was 20 plus years ago. And so Jacob had a lot of chickens coming home to roost, but there's a lot more than even that. When he left Laban, he was on his way back. God had prodded him to come back to Bethel, where he had promised 20 years before to return to, but he started the journey, but he didn't get all the way back. Partial obedience, which always, folks, that always causes problems when we're only partial obedient to God, partially obedient. So he and his family settled outside of a city called Shechem. It was in Canaan. It was in the promised land. It was in the land that God had promised to Abraham, but this is not where God had told him to return. That would have been Bethel, which was about 15 or 20 miles away. The place where he promised God he would return to when he had left Laban's. That was Jacob's promise to God. So at this time he had 11 sons and at least one daughter. Her name was Dinah. A lot of times, he may have had a lot more daughters, we don't know. Generally, in genealogies and stories in the Bible, the females are not mentioned unless they have a specific part in that story. And so Dinah did. That may be why she was the only daughter. There may have been, like I said, a lot, but she was the only one that was mentioned. In chapter 34, while they had settled in Shechem, one of the boys in that town, whose name was also Shechem. The Bible says he was a prince of that city. I don't know if the city was named after him or he was named after the city. I have no idea. But he saw Dinah and he raped her. He took her off and he raped her. And Jacob's sons, 11 of them at this point, or 10 of them at this point, who got all fired up, they didn't like this happening to their sister, which you wouldn't like this happening to your sister either. So Shechem, the son, the guy who had attacked Dinah, and his father came and said the boy had fallen in love with Dinah and now wanted to marry her. Well, the brothers were all still angry, very angry, but they agreed to this, but they said that their sister cannot be married to someone who had not been circumcised. And if all the men of the city had agreed to would agree to be circumcised, they would not harm them. They would not do anything to Shechem. Well, they lied. But Shechem agreed to this, and all the men in the city were circumcised. And two of the brothers, Simeon and Levi, they killed every man in the city while they were still in pain, before they healed up and couldn't defend themselves, and they killed every man in the town. What they did with the women and children, we're not told. Did they sell them into slavery? Very possibly, but we're not told that in the biblical account. And when Jacob was told what happened, it seems he wasn't worried about what his sons had done. There's no signs that he disciplined them in any way. He was more worried about how this would affect him. He was more me focused, which he had been his entire life, if you think back. Always about me, always about him. He was worried what the other tribes, what the other people in and around Shechem would think, and would they come after him. You know, as we look at Jacob, we can say honestly, he was not a very good father. He is not a good example for us at least to this point, of what it means to be a good father. And that brings us to chapter 35. Well, chapter 35 was totally different. It's like everything in 34 was doom and gloom, and this one is very, very different. Chapter 34 did not mention God, not one time, and it's full of lust and murder and deceit and evil. HBO had nothing on the book of Genesis, if you think about it. There was so much stuff going on there. But chapter 35 was all filled with things about the Lord, about God. God is mentioned at least 10 times in this chapter. So the contrast is just amazing. It's striking when we think about it. So, what happened? Well, here's what happened. Jacob begins his return to his spiritual roots, to his spiritual foundation. Now, personal testimony here, I can relate to this. When I got out of high school, I went off to college, I lost my way, totally lost my way. I had a good faith foundation. I grew up in church, was at church every time the doors were open. I was in RAs. I was in all the groups that Baptists had. I did all that stuff. But when I got to college, I just decided I knew better for myself. God had even called me into the ministry when I was in high school. But did I listen? Of course not. I knew better what I wanted to do with my life than God did. So why did I have to listen to him? Well, during college and after that, the wheels started falling off and things just did not go right. But God used that to get my attention. And I returned to him. I remember when it happened. I was in Athens, Alabama, and working at that point, and long time ago, 1978, I think it was, and maybe 79, somewhere in there. But I returned to God. I made that commitment to return to God, and in his mercy and grace, he reissued that call to follow him in ministry. And here it is over 40 years later, and I've never regretted it. So, happily, what we see here in chapter 35, it records Jacob's turnaround and newfound obedience. But that doesn't mean life stops and everything is hunky-dory from this period, from this point on. There were still things that we see in chapter 35 of where life just happens. Halfway through the chapter, or verse 8, we see where Deborah, who had been his mother's nurse, had been her maidservant, had died. And she had obviously been very close in the family. Now, because Rebecca is not mentioned here, it's Rachel, Jacob's mother, it's very possible that she had already died. And so we don't know that. But later in the chapter, we see that his favorite wife sounds weird to say, but that's really what he had here. Rachel, his favorite wife, she died. And then even later in the chapter, his father died. So life goes on, but Jacob has a different foundation now. He's gone back to where he can handle these problems in a much different way. God is becoming the center of Jacob's life instead of something that he just tacks on or doesn't add on at all. So I want to take a look at a couple things that help turn Jacob around here. These are not in your curriculum, okay? I struggle with this lesson probably more than most. So none of this stuff that's really that I'm giving you today is in your curriculum. So if you're inclined to, you may want to take some notes and get some of these things down. One of the things that we see here that happened in Jacob's life was the call from God. We looked at this actually several weeks ago in Genesis 28. 30 years ago, God met Jacob at Bethel, the place where God is telling him to go back to in this chapter. During Jacob's flight from Esau, he was trying to get away from Esau so he wouldn't kill him. And God encouraged him with the vision of angels ascending and descending from heaven on Jacob's ladder, the song that we grew up singing in Bible school. That was back in Genesis 28. And we can probably say with some assurance that this was when Jacob gave his life to God. Not totally sure, but it seems like this was at least the first spiritual encounter that he had with the Lord. Now, this vow was followed by a 20-year adventure serving his uncle Laban off in another land. And at the end of this time, God reminded Jacob of his obligation to leave Laban and return to Bethel. He just reminded him of that. And he did escape from him. He sneaked away without telling Laban, and Laban came after him and finally caught up with him. But then Jacob, even after that, he spent a decade willfully just doing pretty much what he pleased. He had first dwelling outside the promise. He was in the promised land, but outside the city of Shechem, very prosperous city at that time. Instead of going the rest of the way where God had wanted him to go back to Bethel, about 20 miles difference. Listen, partial obedience to God is never right. We do that, we get in trouble. Full obedience is what God requires. And once Jacob figured that out, which he does seem to do so in this chapter, things changed around. This I'll do it my way. Partial obedience brought a lot of tragedy, and that's where we see what happened to Dinah. We see all these people these men that his sons killed, and then we see the rest of the people in that town being sold in slavery, maybe. Like I said, we don't really know for sure, but something happened to them. All these things made Jacob an unwanted resident in the land. But more significantly than all of that, it made him where he was finally ready to hear God's voice. C.S. Lewis, you probably heard of him, maybe you've read some of his stuff. He's pretty deep. He says, paraphrase here, God shouts to us in our pain. And that's what he did to Jacob here. He shouted to him in his pain because nothing was going right in his life. God's going to get our attention one way or another. If we don't get it, if he doesn't get it now, it's going to be a little bit more difficult a little bit later on down the road. But he's eventually going to get us to where we stop, and we have to deal with God one way or the other. We may still disobey, but he will get our attention. And thankfully for Jacob, he listened and he obeyed. And those are important things. So in verse 1 of chapter 35, we see that God tells him to go to Bethel, and go to Bethel right now. No, let's quit messing around. Let's do what I told you to do to start with. Now, this became sort of a religious pilgrimage because the words here, go up, suggest that. Generally, go up means when we say go up, we mean go up north, or go down, we think go down south. Well, generally in the Bible, when it says go up, that means to a place of a higher elevation, or go down, it's a lower elevation. So they look at it a little bit different, but this one has an even different meaning. This one has to do with a spiritual level here. And so he's going up to Bethel. And it's going to culminate with building an altar here. Bethel was long known. It had a different name, and I can't remember now what it was, but it had a different name before Jacob named it Bethel 30 years ago, 20 years ago. But at that point, it was a very big Canaanite god. There were altars of all different kinds of gods here. And so, but what Jacob was doing, he was declaring the name of the true God. That's why he built an altar there. Now, the second thing we see here that turned Jacob around was his obedience. The effects of what happened with Dinah, the murder and the plunder of the Shechemites were twofold. First, there was defilement through contact with the corpses of the dead. And secondly, religious contamination by the taking and possession of their gold and their idols. They had a lot of idols. So now Jacob, in the process of restoring his relationship with God, he steps up and takes charge, which is something we don't see a lot of in the Bible with Jacob. And he gives his family explicit instructions to his family and his servants. He said, get rid of all your idols, purify yourselves, and change your clothes. Now, all three of these are important in their own way. Up to this point, the only idols that we know that they had in the family were ones that Rachel had stolen from her father, Laban. That was one of the reasons that Laban came after him. He wanted to get his idols back. But there seems to be a lot more now. And so they collected all of those. Maybe they came from the people in Shechem when they plundered the city. Maybe they gathered up all this stuff. We don't know, okay? We honestly don't know. But apparently there were a lot of them, and they buried them underneath a tree. Now, the purification part had to deal with a complete washing of their body from head to toe, both literally and symbolically. This symbolically meant that they were leaving their sin behind. They were turning over a new leaf. Now, the change of clothes depicted a new life as they started on their return to Bethel. Changing clothes was a big deal back then. Unlike us, when our boys were growing up, I thought they went through 3, 4, 5, 6 outfits a day. They just kept changing clothes all the time. If it got one little thing on it, that was it. They had to take it off. But back then, that just did not happen. Unless you were rich, you basically had one change of clothes. You wore the same clothes pretty much all the time. I did some research. Closets were not invented until the 1600s. So they had no idea what a closet was, especially with all the hangers and everything we have now. So finding a change of clothes and putting them on was a very big deal at this point. Now, notice something very important here. Jacob was obviously aware of his family's idolatry. But before, he either did not or could not do anything about it. I think he chose not to, is what it was. He was just so lax in his faith, that didn't really care about this kind of stuff, that he just allowed this to go on. But now, something is different. Something is very different. He's now seeking out to do things God's way. It was a changed life. God was purifying Jacob. He was making a difference in his life. Now, from Shechem, Jacob and his people would travel to Bethel as a brand new people. They were on a spiritual high. This infected apparently the whole family, but it started with Jacob, and their obedience was now apparent, immediate, and full obedience where it hadn't been before. Washed, purged, and reclothed, they set out for Bethel. Now, earlier I mentioned in chapter 34 where Jacob was afraid of the surrounding tribes and what they were going to do to him because of what happened. But instead, verse 5 tells us in chapter 35, tells us that there was a terror from God over all the people around there. And so they did not bother Jacob and his family. This is sort of like the fear that happened with the Israelites when Joshua was getting ready to lead them into the promised land in Joshua 2:9. It says that the fear of God came over all the people, and they did not want the people in. They did not want to fight the people because they knew that their God was with them. Now at Bethel, he built an altar, and where he had called the place Bethel before, house of God, now he changes the name to El Bethel. Now it means the God of Bethel. Or, it's just more emphatic as far as who God is here. And so Jacob worshipped at the altar and offered sacrifices to God there. And as he fulfilled his 30-year vow, he gratefully gave a tenth of everything he had to the Lord. At last, Jacob was in the place he was supposed to be, worshiping with a heart that was right with God. And that's where God wants us. Now, Deborah, we talked about her a little bit earlier. That's where it fits into our chronology here. The second thing I want us to think about is blessing. The obedience and worship of Jacob was followed by a blessing direct from the mouth of God. Now, this is pretty incredible because it's almost exactly like the blessing and the covenant that God had given Abraham back in chapter 17. There's three parallels between what God told Abraham and what he told Jacob here. The first one was God gave them both new names. He changed Abram to Abraham, and he changed Jacob to Israel. Now, he did that last week, right? I mean, that was in our lesson for last Sunday. He changed his name to Israel. But what had changed? At that point, nothing. At this point, God does it again because Jacob has changed. He is now trying to do his best to follow God. So 30 years of living for himself and now living for God. That's the story of a whole lot of us. My story in a lot of ways. God reaffirmed to Jacob that in spite of taking his eyes off of God for 3 decades, God's plan for him had not changed. It was still the same plan. My story, very similar to that I shared a while ago about God's call on my life. Your story may have a very similar experience to that. He was now rehabilitated. He was confirmed and he was validated by God himself in the promised land. He was where he was supposed to be. Secondly, God used his name. When God was talking, he said, "My name is El Shaddai, God Almighty." El Shaddai signifies that can't talk God's power and sovereignty. It describes a God who makes everything happen by means of his majestic power and might. He's the one who fulfills every promise. And it's Shaddai, God Almighty, who now blesses Jacob. And then the third parallel is similar to those that used in the blessing to Abraham, would be about things to come. You're going to have fruitfulness. You're going to have a great nation. You're going to have kings, and you're going to have this land. This is all in verses 11 and 12. Abraham learned that kings would come from him in Genesis 17, and now Jacob's hearing the very same thing here. Great parallel there. 1,000 years down the line, King David would came from the line of Judah, and then we see that eventually in the life of Jesus Christ. So it would ultimately be fulfilled that way. All these things that God had told Abraham, they were still in the promises that he gave to Jacob. Now, another thing is consecration. His blessing had caused Jacob to desire to worship him. We see this in verses 14 and 15. The fact that the consecration ritual won't be on the original some 30 years ago is no surprise. God is always giving us more of the promise as time goes on. He gave this place a new name. Like I said a while ago, he now calls it El Bethel, literally the God of Bethel, or the God of the house of God. This is the real deal. And Jacob understood it with the depth and devotion that he was not capable of 30 years ago. Think back 30 years in your life. Was God able to share with you things then that he can share with you now, and you understand what they were? Probably not. Probably not. It's just that we develop our relationship over a period of time, or we're not at a point in our life that maybe we can understand what it is that God's trying to tell us. So there's a much deeper and expanded understanding that's common to all of us. You know, as new Christians, we learn a lot of stuff. We're inexperienced, but all this stuff is new, and we grow spiritually from that. But then years later, the ups and downs of life, sometimes it's easy to fall away. It certainly did for me. Was I saved when I was 9 years old? Yes. I struggled with that for a long time, but I finally decided, and God helped me see that he had saved me when I was 9 years old. But it wasn't until I was 25 that I fully gave my life to him. And that's when I was at a spiritual place in my life where I needed him, and I started to understand what it was he wanted me to do with my life, or actually what he wanted to do with my life. Now, do you have a story like that? Share it with your class. Think about it before class, and just sort of get your thoughts together and share your story. Other people in your class may have a story like that. You might want to call a couple of them. Don't do it on Sunday morning, but call a couple of them on Friday or Saturday and ask them if they would mind sharing their stories of how they eventually came to understand who God was. And I'm telling you, you will have a worshipful time in your class on Sunday if you do that. This was a difficult lesson as far as pulling application out of it. It took me over a week to come to the point where I feel like that's what God would tell me as I would teach this class, is to let's use this as a worship time to see where God has brought every one of us. That application always works, and it will work with this week too. God bless you. Be praying for you for Sunday, and look forward to hearing some good results.